During the night, with the endless starlit sky covering the whole world, a single street unfurled away from a one-horse town, sat amid endless flat, arid scrubland. A large SUV ran on said street, heading out of town. Half an hour later, the SUV left the road and braved the rough desert, leaving behind the comfort offered by the artificial lighting created by civilization. There would be no need for that, not on a night like that. Jane Foster parked quietly the SUV in an apparently random stretch of the desert, and as the vehicle finally came to a halt, with its engine's roar dying down to a tired purring before finally going quiet, a metallic whirring accompanied the unfolding of the roof's panels as if it was some kind of flower. The underside of the panels housed a wide variety of hand-built devices, whose purpose would be unclear to all but a selected few. Namely, Jane Foster, and Erik Selvig. The duo of scientists left the isolated confines of the vehicle and fussed around the electrical devices that were pointed to the starry sky, checking and checking again that everything was to the specification of the young scientists that had brought those machines into the world out of sheer determination and keen wit. Jane Foster was a woman in her late 20s, with long straight brown hair and a pair of brown eyes that didn't manage to hide the sheer sharpness of the inquisitive mind they had behind them. She moved uncaring of the surprising coldness of the night, ignoring the whisper of a tired wind that older souls would have recognized as foreboding. She put her torso through the roof of the SUV, positioning a magnetometer so that its monitor was calibrated with the constellations above. It appeared to be almost cobbled together from spare parts of other devices. "Hurry!" Jane half-whispered half-ordered to both her companions and the world itself. She knew she was right this time. There couldn't be any errors in her calculations. She had been checking those for the past year, she was sure. A loud bang followed by muffled cursing from below made the scientist huff in fond exasperation as she offered a hand down, helping her mentor back to his feet. Erik Selvig, a man in his 60s with a respectable gut and deep blue eyes that almost shone in the dark, continued his tired muttering while slowly rubbing his head. "It's always the same spot. Why do I hit always the same spot?" "Because you never watch your head," Jane Foster replied with a snort, receiving one in return. The man finished straightening up. "Thanks for the vote of confidence. So what's this anomaly of yours supposed to look like?" The female scientist shook her head a little. "It's a little different each time. Once it looked like, I don't know, melted stars, pooling in a corner of the sky. But last week it was a rolling rainbow ribbon, racing round Orion?" Her mentor interrupted her with fond exasperation. "I've always said you should have been a poet." "Nice alliteration, this talk of molten stars pooling." Jane ignored her mentor and forced herself to calm down, reining in her excitement. She could have not bothered, for Erik Selvig, despite having a mind that operated better with hard numbers than people, knew her well enough that he could almost feel her enthusiasm like a wave of heat over his skin. Jane's voice broke once again the quiet of the night. "Hey, Darcy. Pass up the bubbly and my gloves, will you?" A disgruntled intern with dark hair and an ample bosom, with an attitude that could have rivaled it, huffed as she handed to her current boss a bottle of champagne and a pair of gloves through the window. Jane passed the bottle to Selvig to hold while she pulled on the old leather gloves, far too large and masculine for her small hands. He starts to unwrap the foil, and she stops his hand with an excited grin. "Not until you see it." Her eyes sparkled in the reflection of the machinery's lights. A fond smile blossomed on Selvig's face as he nodded towards the gloves. "I recognize those. Think how proud he'd be to see you now," he said as he placed the bottle of cheap champagne on the SUV's hood. Jane's grin softly faded to a sad smile, and she almost wasn't heard over the quiet of the night as she whispered, "Thank you." "For what?" "For the benefit of the doubt." The two stared out at the sky expectantly, each lost in their own thoughts. A long couple of minutes seemed to stretch themselves beat while the machinery scanned the skies. Nothing. After the second minute, the scientist started to become worried. A frown marred Jane's elegant brow. "It's never taken this long before." In that moment, Darcy called up from the front seat with a bored tone, "Can I turn on the radio?" "Sure, if you like rocking out to KFRM, all agriculture, all the time," The scientist snarked back with worry clearly written on her features. It's not like you'll be on the first line to see the most extraordinary event of the last millennium. The radio was uncaringly turned on, and after a glance exchanged with Eric, Jane headed back into the vehicle, unwilling to recognize the pity in her mentor's eye. The inside of the SUV was bathed in the glow of high-tech monitoring equipment and laptops, some looking like they were held together with duct tape, while others were actually held together with a clever combination of pins and rubber bands. In the eerily and almost otherworldly light of the screens and accompanied by a less than welcome Darcy humming along with a song that would be forgotten within the week, Jane opened a well-worn leather-bound book made of handwritten notes and calculations. Selvig watched the frustrated Jane with sympathy from the lowered car window. "Jane," he tried. "The anomalies are always precipitated by geomagnetic storms." She cut him off, fingering a couple of pages in particular that she turned towards her mentor. "The last 17 occurrences have been predictable to the minute. I just don't understand." Her voice began to sound frustrated then. On the front seat, something caught Darcy's eye out the driver's side mirror, and as adjusted it, she spotted odd glowing clouds forming in the distance. "Jane?" Jane shushed her, still leafing through her notes as the forgotten bottle of champagne began to vibrate. "There's got to be some new variable. Or an equipment malfunction." As she finished speaking, the lights and equipment in the SUV began to flicker around them, while the computer monitors squelched and died with static. "I don't think there's anything wrong with your equipment." Darcy finally managed to catch her attention as the champagne bottle started to rattle noisily now as it shook more violently over the SUV's hood. Selvig stopped eyeing with worry at his protégé in order to turn towards the bottle, which was suddenly the object of Jane's curiosity too. As they watched it intently, Darcy was still transfixed in looking the strange light play just outside of the scientist's field of view. The pressure built up inside the bottle, until finally, the cork exploded out of it and the cheap champagne rained over the baffled Selvig. "Jane?" Darcy's voice became suddenly urging. "What?" the other woman snapped, still confused by the champagne's behavior. "I think you want to see this. Both of you." Darcy pointed out the window, causing the others to turn. A few kilometers northeast of their position, over the desert, massive clouds of rainbow light churned in the sky, putting to shame whatever episode Jane had hoped to register that night. "Holy Shatner!" Jane's brain stuttered still before quickly rebooting. "That's your subtle aurora?" Selvig ironically asked as he climbed back in the SUV. "No, yes, I don't know. Let's go." She put herself behind the wheel, uncaring of the fact that Selvig had just closed the SUV doors behind him, and started to drive towards the sheer impossibility that they were witnessing. The SUV raced towards the strange event with the roof panels still open. Jane, amazed by the sight, ignored the damage that the machinery was undergoing, keeping her torso bent forward over the wheel, as if to will the vehicle to move faster, while Darcy had taken up a camera, which to be truthful Jane had shoved into her hands, and was taking video of the light storm before them. The bumps that the SUV took were ignored and categorized immediately as acceptable collateral damage while Jane grinned, thrilled, pumped with adrenaline. "Isn't this great?" she exclaimed as a thought struck her. "You're seeing it too, right? I'm not crazy?" "That's debatable," came the baffled voice of Selvig, "but you'll be dead if you don't put your seatbelt on." Without any warning, the SUV lurched sideways, forcing Jane to put all of her weight to keep the wheel from ignoring her will. Just as suddenly, up ahead, spiraling down from out of the clouds came an enormous tornado, suffused with a rainbow light roaring like 1,000 freight trains as it touched an impossibly shuddering earth. While Jane kept pushing forward, her eyes lost in the storm of color and wind around them, Selvig looked up through the still open sunroof at the enormous glowing final cloud with wonder, while Darcy was still busy taping the storm. "We've got to get closer so I can take a magnetic reading." Jane's voice came out frazzled as she drove, making Darcy laugh hysterically. "Yeah, right. Good one." Then, as she realized what her current boss was doing, she paled. "Oh God, you're serious? You want those college credits or not?" The SUV disturbed two ravens perched on a cactus as they raced past, making the birds take flight quietly in the not longer dark night, when crack-a-boom. A huge bolt of lightning struck down through the center of the funnel cloud in front of the SUV with a terrifying intensity, making it rack from the blast. Moved by an instinct for survival that few humans would ever need to call upon, Darcy forcefully grabbed the wheel, turning it and trying to head away as she could already smell ashes and fire around them. Keep the credits. I'll intern at Burger King. Jane pushed the intern back as strongly as she could. What are you doing? Saving our lives. The women struggled for control of the wheel, when suddenly the headlights fell on a human figure in front of them. The man was directly in their path, stumbling through the winds. Darcy slammed on the brakes, squishing Jane's foot while the scientist turned the wheel hard enough to hear the SUV cry in protest. Giving proof of how far humanity has actually come, the SUV swerved, but just too late. The side of the vehicle slammed into the man with a loud thud, sending him flying while the car skidded to a stop. Inside the SUV, Jane, Darcy, and Selvig traded shocked looks, breathing hard before peering through the dust clouds, unable to see through. After a paralyzed moment, they all leapt out of the SUV. The three raced from the SUV with flashlights searching around them. Jane spots the man lying on the ground. He's dressed in tattered clothing, charred and blackened. I think that was legally your fault. Darcy quickly spoke. Jane raced back to the SUV to the first aid kit. With Darcy heading back with her, stopping only when she spotted Selvig bent over, puking his guts out. She grimaced and still moved to the SUV, unwilling to get close to the man in that particular moment while she took up her trusty taser. Soon after the woman left the SUV, reaching the knocked out man where Jane knelt down, pulling out the medkit. Selvig hollered, "Girls! I need help with him." "Him?" Jane and Darcy said together, before Darcy made a sign to Jane to go to Selvig, the image of the man puking still fresh in her mind. She wasn't going to poke that with a 10-foot pole, thank you very much. Jane soon enough joined Eric, who was still looking at the charred form of a one-armed man unconscious on the cold ground. The elderly man, because that amount of wrinkles and classical wizardry beard couldn't hint to anything but, was a mess, besides the deep gouges in his skin, which looked like they had been cauterized. The man's skin was of an angry red in the places where it wasn't torn, likely suffering of a burn of some degree. While his modesty, along with his left thigh, was covered by the burned remains of what could have once been some sort of kimono, and thank God for small mercies, Jan kept unknowingly tracking the unending amount of scars that littered the body, grimacing where the skin was lucid and bumpy when compared to its surroundings. She took in all of that with a single glance, her acute mind managing to put together those details with a stark clarity under the light offered by the SUV's lights, which were fortunately or not, pointed in the right direction. Then her stomach caught up with her mind, and it was only thanks to Selvig's actions that she didn't puke over the heavily wounded man. Maybe that lighting hit him. Selvig weakly offered as Jane freed her stomach, "We need to bring him to the hospital, Jane, he's still breathing." While Jane was otherwise occupied, Darcy looked down at the admittedly handsome hulk of a man, unsure about what to do. She hovered around, mentally warring with herself. Jane had taken with her the medkit, so she should have gone and retrieved it, but she didn't know the first thing about first aid, and the man looked fine, even if the SUV smashing him probably didn't agree with him. Darcy opted to ignore Jane and Eric's voices as the blonde at her feet suddenly groaned, slowly regaining his senses as his eyes fluttered open. She looked deep into his confused, azure eyes, which at last focused on her form. Then the man frowned. Less than a dozen meters from there, the two scientists were trying to keep their wits about them. "Jane, we need to go. Bring here the SUV and clear some space in the back. The less we move him, the better." Selvig's voice broke her out from her musings. Jane didn't think to stop to get a reading on the storm, clearly seeing the extreme conditions in which the man was, but still regretfully watching the storm evaporate from above their heads. In that moment, she heard a startled scream from Darcy, "Fake this!" and the telltale snapping of her trusty taser. As they rode back, Jane had only one thought in her mind: where did they come from? The SUV sits parked before the emergency room entrance. After a gaggle of nurses and medics pushed the one-armed, charred, scarred elderly in intensive care and another couple of orderlies set the blond man on a gurney, Jane and Darcy stood before a sweet, ditzy admission nurse. "Names?" the woman asked in a bored tone. The blonde one said it was Thor. Jane answered, her mind battling between the options in her head. Was it better to reason about the storm, about the man they hit with the SUV, or the positively ancient one that appeared as if charred by that terrifying burst of lighting that almost hit their vehicle? The nurse painstakingly typed it into the computer, one key at a time while Thor was wheeled out of the room. "We have no idea about the other one, we just found them together," Selvig answered before the nurse could ask them about the older man. "Thor," the nurse spelled, "and your relationship to him?" "I've never met him before." "Until she hit him with the car," Darcy helpfully added. "Grazed him, actually." Jane grimaced while looking around in the small room, "but Darcy tasered him, too." Unbidden, a snort came out of the nurse, who seemed to be delighted by that detail. "Must have been quite the spat." "I told you, I don't know him." Jane frowned, "I just want to make sure he's okay." "I'm going to need a name and contact number. With the kind of wounds the old man had on him, you should really wait here, the police will want to take your version of the story." The nurse unsympathetically spoke, "And there are cameras that have already your face, along with the car you came here with, so running away will be a hassle for everyone, especially because I'll have to give a statement too in that case." "There was no crime involved," Jane protested, crossing her arm and taking a step back in outrage. The nurse returned to slowly typing on the keyboard, one key at a time. "You called her Darcy. "Oh, for God's sake." Selvig reached over Jane's shoulder and handed to the nurse his business card. "We'll wait for the police in the hall." While Jane, Darcy and Eric gave her statements to the police, which had been called because of the wounds on the elderly patient the three had brought in, and while said patient was attended by a gaggle of nurses and medics trying to figure out how could someone in such bad conditions breathe so steadily, in the room number 43, Thor, disgraced son of Odin, slowly came to his senses. Thor, wearing nothing but a hospital gown, winced in pain as he awakened on a gurney to find a brunette standing over him with a syringe in his arm. "Hi." A brunette nurse smiled calmly, "Just taking a little blood." Thor slapped the syringe away with an angry movement of his arm as he sat up, pushing the nurse towards the door while he wildly looked around. "How dare you attack the son of Odin?" The trained reactions of the nurse allowed her to immediately push the help button secured on the side of the door. "I need some help here," causing two orderlies to race over, attempting to hold Thor down. "We're trying to help you." One of the two attempted to calm the clearly confused patient. "Then bring me a healing stone, you savages." The extremely awake man rose from his bed, hurling one of the orderlies off and smashing the other against a wall as a third and a fourth entered the room, accompanied by a male nurse who had joined the commotion. "What the hell is this guy on?" the male nurse yelled while his group struggled to keep the blond man down. "Nothing yet." The first nurse, now with a bloodied lip, pulled out a syringe while the others managed to force him back down onto the gurney. And as the nurse injected him with the sedative, Thor appeared both shocked and amazed that he had actually been overpowered by such a small group. The blond man roared in outrage, "You're no match for the mighty." Thor struggled to spoke those words, stilling for a beat before passing out. Outside of room 45, where the heavily wounded man had been placed after his wounds had been addressed and an oxygen mask placed over his mouth when it appeared clear that he was perfectly capable of breathing on his own, two policemen leaned against the wall, shifting their weight occasionally while they tried to understand what exactly was going on. "We've looked over the van that they used to bring him here, the blood there is his," the dogs agree, "but the owners aren't the type of people to do that. Besides, why and how?" asked the first. "Dunno? A flamethrower?" the second man tried to guess. He was on his 20s, with brown hair and eyes, and, given the kind of stuff he had always had to deal with in such a backwater small city, was feeling out of his depth. "Where the fuck would have they picked up a flamethrower?" "I said I don't know." After a condescending grunt, his superior spoke out loud his thoughts. In any case, the old man is some sort of soldier, no doubt. Besides the whole one-arm thing, the doctors say they've never seen so many scars. Stab wounds, scorching, electrification, something that the surgeon swears are bite marks the size of my chest. We've no idea of who that man is, but considering the state in which the storm chasers found him, I'd say he wouldn't want to be found by those that he was with before. The older man adjusted his trousers, feeling the pull a bit against his respectable gut. They've got degrees. The younger man objected. What? The storm chasers have got degrees. The man clarified, bashfully scratching the back of his head and not looking his superior in the eye. So? So they're not storm chasers, those are the freaks. When people with degrees do something strange is an innovative and original contribution to the world. I'm understanding that your nephew is still convinced about college? She is, the man sighed. It's a good thing, and we're all proud of her, don't get me wrong, but sometimes it gets really heavy, you know? When I get home, I don't need to hear all about her ambitions, do I? The older policeman shrugged unhelpfully before scratching his nose. Congratulations? Condolences? Thanks for both, man. The younger man replied tiredly. So, now we wait for him to wake up? A grunt and a nod was an answer that he would have preferred to not receive. It was going to be a long night. After a time of infinite fall through a void beyond his understanding or perception, beyond hope and desperation, without sight, hearing or touch, Yamamoto breathed and discovered that once more, he had lungs to fill. His eyelids felt as heavy as lead, and in the absence of senses that he had briefly found herself trapped into, he grasped with all of himself, every sensation, every feeling, every otherwise ignored twitch of muscles under his skin. He breathed, marveling at the rushing air that went through him, feeling with distant understanding how his diaphragm moved to allow him to let air inside of his chest. He stirred briefly and felt that his skin was nothing but a veil between muscles and sinew and a cloth that had been placed over him. A constant beeping sound was, in the end, the one detail that made him open his eyes, and he was, at least at first, confused. He blinked quickly, slowly but surely returning aware and categorizing his surroundings even if his vision remained blurry. Maybe it was the storm to trounce him like that? Lightning and being blown off your feet over the desert would trounce pretty much everyone. Voices that he couldn't recognize pierced through the hazy thought processes that still hindered Yamamoto, his bushy and burnt eyebrows furrowing in confusion at the sounds in a foreign language that hit his aged ears. And as if the sound of another human voice was a trigger, the mind of the man that held together Soul Society for more than 1,000 years cleared, his senses and thoughts returning to their usual sharpness. With only a glance, he realized, in order, 3 things. First, there wasn't a battle going on. Second, he lost to the Quincy's king. Third, he was no longer in Soul Society. The world felt at once vaster and dimmer, his own Ryotsu pouring out of himself at speeds that should have cracked the reality around him, but that instead seemed to behave like oil over water. If the old Shinigami needed a confirmation that he no longer was in Soul Society, that was it. Yamamoto Shigekuni, you never managed to follow things through. Why else do you think I never considered you one of the 5 warring potentials? Yuki's last words echoed in the one-armed, wounded Shinigami as if they were being spoken out loud. The ancient man gritted his teeth in outrage at the words of that man, responsible for the death of countless souls. Why didn't you heal your left arm? Had you ordered that human girl, she would have surely done it. But why didn't you? I already know. You just didn't want to depend on a human. The ethereal voice was mocking now, and even pedantic, presenting an irrelevant question with the heavy implication that it was more meaningful than what it actually was. The knuckles of his remaining hand popped when he clenched his fist strong enough to crumple steel like it was paper. For a single instant, Yamamoto could only fear sheer rage. What he had built, gone. 1,000 years to shape those who wielded power into protectors instead of common bandits, dust in the wind. I know all about it. Even during the battle with Aizen, you were uncomfortable relying on the human, Kurosaki Ichigo. And now, You try to not only shoulder the entirety of Soul Society on your shoulders alone, but the fate of the rest of the world too. That is why you have lost. A barely restrained chuckle seemed to seep between a word and the next, igniting anew the blood in Yamamoto's veins. Without saying a single word, the old man forced himself to seat, categorizing his own wounds from what his senses told him, but still, while he did no longer give any sign of the raging inferno of his abject fury, his spirit was thundering in outrage. You've gotten weak, Yamamoto Shigekuni. The former you was different. When the Gota 13 just begun, you were known only as divisions and were actually just a bunch of murderous thugs. But that was precisely why you were a group to be feared. You, who ruled over that group, were a true sword demon. The mockery was gone now, as if Wak was actually being respectful of the downed opponent. His rather insane pain tolerance allowed him to treat the throbbing wounds like benchmarks to measure his own health, but now, he was even grateful for the pain, because he gave him an excuse to not think about the Quincy's words. You would have done anything in order to cut down your opponent. You were someone who couldn't care less for the lives of his subordinates. Was he an inexperienced man, or Shinigami, he would have paused at the gravity of his own wounds, but his recent defeat was simply too massive to allow him to rest until he healed. Yamamoto knew what Wak had been talking about, he remembered it, how could he not? Authority is always born from power, and in the very beginning, he and his were exactly that, authority in virtue of the power they were capable to bring forth. But all of that changed after the extermination of us, Quincy. Once you got things to protect, once you got your hands on some peace, with that worthless justice and pride, you and yours became a group of weaklings. If the wounds hadn't killed him by now, they wouldn't in the future. He concluded his self-examination, even as his mind ran over the endless years of warfare and strife he had to endure in order to establish his rule, the rule of the powerful, and the vastly more complex and delicate task of slowly turning that power inwards, so that he and his people could command themselves, know themselves, and be something more than violence unneeded, something better than the rule of might. Even in death, you lie there unknowingly, but let me tell you, Soul Society is going to be destroyed, because the Gota 13 died 1,000 of years ago, along with us. With a last deep breath, the head commander found once more his balance, remembering that even if now those years were gone, even if he had ultimately failed in his self-appointed purpose, that millennium and change of order, somewhat merciful if not always rightful, had happened. The souls that walked Soul Society in those years wouldn't know the nightmare that it was before. Nobody would thank Yamamoto for his efforts, mostly because he carried them out with the edge of his blade, but he was proud nevertheless. It was difficult to assume a perspective that so closely resembled those of mortal beings, that enjoyed everything knowing instinctively that it wouldn't last. Yamamoto couldn't deny that he had been much more dangerous in his youth, even if less experienced and not as powerful. Was losing that might worth the millennia of pace? The years spent guiding the lost? Nurturing the young? Blowing kindly upon the tiny embers of hope for a better tomorrow? After a last fortifying deep breath, his never-ending rage, his fury, that could set the very world aflame, was subdued, an inferno brought to heel, reduced to a single number, ready to burst. Only then, Yamamoto's head turned slowly, mindful but not scared of his own injuries, and he started to take notice of his surroundings. The words of Wak now faded away from his mind. Discipline isn't easily discarded, even when everything around you falls down. Methodically, he started to set a system of objectives and targets with the mind far too used to keep going in face of adversities. Yes. Losing his absolute power over Soul Society, in exchange for the headaches borne by dividing that right to rule had been a worthy exchange. A grim smile found his way on the weathered features of the elderly warrior. For all of his cunning and undeniable power, Wak couldn't even come close to understand why Shigekuni Yamamoto Genryūsai acted as he had. Power for the sake of power. The one-armed god of death almost scoffed at the image of the man that had ultimately defeated him. For all of Wak's power, for all of his ambition, for all of his success, the Quincy king hadn't even realized that as rulers, they stood in completely different leagues. Shaking his head minutely, he schooled himself, his eyes briefly looking around. He was in an insipid room of a human hospital, that much was clear. Outside, the nervous presence of two stationary figures informed him that the humans had placed guards to keep an eye on the situation. Wise of them, if meaningless. His sharp senses stretched over an impressive stretch of land, but soon enough he focused them on the building he was in particular over a human. That was not, in fact, human. Not a Shinigami, not a Quincy, surely not a hollow. It didn't feel like Kurosaki Ichigo had, but there were similarities and many of them at that. Power, rumbling and erratic, that should have been able to roll over the world very much like the one Yamamoto himself wielded, was kept bound in the spiritual equivalent of 32 golden chains, visible only to the refined senses of the ancient Shinigami. In the distance, at the very edge of his senses, Yamamoto could feel something that was echoing the power of the strange creature that was remaining stationary at the floor beneath his. It was a matter of seconds to bring his spiritual pressure low enough to overwhelm the souls of the humans waiting outside his room, and then he walked out, distasteful but uncaring of the state of his clothing, that clearly depicted him as someone that shouldn't have been roaming alone to the eyes of humans. But that hardly mattered. There wasn't that subtle feeling of tension in the air that when broken could lead back to soul society. No, if he was right, and he had no reason to believe otherwise, Yamamoto wasn't on the mortal earth that so closely was intertwined with Weko Mundo and soul society. He followed his senses, gritting his teeth when the labyrinth-like succession of corridors, stairs, and strange rooms made him occasionally blunder on his way towards his target, until he once more brought his soul to bear on the unsuspecting humans, that fell to the ground in a crumpled mess, allowing him to enter the room of the only one that could represent the key to the knowledge of the actual circumstances. When he closed the door behind himself with a sharp clack, the man whose power was bound whipped his head in Yamamoto's direction. "I am Thor Odinson, mortal." The boisterous blonde thundered in his bounds, "God of thunder. Now free me, so that I can recover the mighty Mjolnir." The old man walked forward with measured steps, slowly but surely nearing the head of the bed, where he briefly opened his eyes to stare at the blonde, who stammered, "You're no mortal." The silence exuded by the aged Shinigami was confirmation as good as any other, but after a couple of seconds, the raspy yet commanding voice of Yamamoto echoed in the small room, "Your situation. Your bound power, is it because of the absence of your weapon? How do you?" Thor frowned heavily. "Did my father send you?" "No." Now that he was close to this curious being, Yamamoto found himself wondering if the distant item that he felt was connected to the bound blonde acted in the same way as a Fullbringer's focus, and how could he use the situation to his advantage. "But then, how do you know of Mjolnir?" "It rests at the edge of my senses." The aged Shinigami turned his closed eyes towards the boisterous youth tied to the bed, "But it's calling to you, that much is clear." At the frown of the blonde, Yamamoto spoke, lest the youth started to ramble like they tended to do, never getting to the actually important topic he was trying to reach. "I have a sword, that to me is like that hammer is to you." "Where's your weapon then, old man?" "Broken." His sword had been broken, the physical manifestation of his own soul, that he had known and refined for more than a millennium, had been first stolen away, then used against him by that scumwalk. But then, Thor could clearly feel the power exuded by the old man next to his bed, even if it was precisely controlled, and it sat just beyond the reach of mortal men. It wasn't something that could be explained with the use of a weapon. It came from within, and it was undeniable. "I am more than the application of my power, foolish child." The one-armed elder reprimanded the bound ex-god of thunder. "The sword isn't my soul, only its manifestation." Yamamoto's eye opened a fraction, freezing the self-declared god of thunder in place. "It's only a matter of forging her anew." He spoke thoughtfully, his mind trying and failing to come up with an obvious and immediate way to reforge what was lost, "Even if I'm no swordsmith. The talent necessary to create a soul cutter belonged solely to Tsunemaya, who rightfully owned the title of God of the Sword." Yamamoto was far from being defenseless, or powerless, but a Shinigami without Zanpakuto. It was simply wrong. Long the dwarves of Nidavellir have been friends of Asgard, mightiest smiths across the whole universe. Thor laughed at his good fortune, now that he found a direction to regain his own power, even if it was paved by the company of this unnerving old man. Help me retrieve Mjolnir, and I'll ensure that the dwarves forge know what was broken. The gray eyes of the ancient Shinigami opened fully then, if only for an instant, and in that second, Thor felt himself being weighted, and he knew, in his gut, that if he fell short of whatever measure the old man was taking of him, or if he ever went back on his word, he would die. But the god of thunder had always liked a challenge. Yamamoto nodded, and in 10 seconds flat, Thor was free of his bounds, and the unlikely duo was crossing the hospital pointing to the exit. Under the unforgiving sun, the duo composed of the towering blonde and the one-armed elderly raised more than a single eyebrow, but while they never encountered a single mortal enforcer, almost as if tied by cause of some magic they managed to choose the path that allowed them to walk freely. The random human concerned about the appearance of the two hesitated when it came to actually intervene. There was something, in the air, in the way the two walked, in the way their stony expressions didn't even consider the existence of the people around them, of a nerve-restrained hostility, of a bomb about to go off. Something that spoke to the atrophied survival sense of the humans, something that whispered at the corner of their primal mind, do not be seen. Avoid the predator. Run. Hide. A tense silence seemed to both precede and follow the two, and once they turned an angle, only then, heavy sighs of relief could be heard, with cold sweat rolling off temples, parched mouths gulping as if to seek water to wash away the foreboding feeling that almost cracked their beings. Your weapon is too far for your body to handle the travel. Yamamoto spoke calmly as the two walked. How would you? Thor started to object, only to relent when he felt the shift in the elder's expression. No, his face hadn't moved in the slightest, remaining the blank, stony wall that it had always been, but the god of thunder felt clear that the man's patience was at an end. In the same way, the mortals felt wary at the scarred man. He knew that protesting or speaking against the bald man's opinion would have meant nothing good. Once we succeed, old man, I'll let your eyes feast on the magnificence of my home. Thor boasted to the vaguely interested god of death, who kept walking with his eyes closed, relying on his other senses to navigate, since he preferred to not shatter the mortals around them unduly. His thoughts on the powerful blonde at his side wavered between exasperation and wistfulness. He was very much like another student Yamamoto once had, spontaneous, boisterous, powerful. But where the general commander has beaten the carelessness out of the whelp, Thor looked like a child far too used to power. One that acted carelessly, with a single-track mind, and a general, unknowing disregard of the consequences. Foolish child. The god of death wanted to express his disappointment, but it was neither the time nor the place. The duo of estranged gods walked out in the park of the hospital. Blue sky. One sun. This must be the realm of Midgard. I wasn't sure. Thor spoke thoughtfully once he had an actual chance to take in the sky over their heads. How many realms? Yamamoto's voice questioned him, making the depowered god of thunder frown at the ignorance of what he had assumed was an extremely wise and knowledgeable entity. Where must you come from, if you know nothing of the 9? The universe is vast, that is true, but gods tend to orbit around Yggdrasil. Be they Asgardian or not. Thor answered his question while posing another, only to receive silence in turn. How do you travel between realms? Well, the Bivarest. Thor started to answer, looking around curiously even as the old man kept his pace towards the. Hey! A female voice cut in their conversation, accompanied by the squealing of tires on the hot concrete and the groaning of brakes pulled too hard. Hey you! The duo turned towards the mortal soul lacking in survival instinct that she breezed through the general menacing feeling that Yamamoto was giving off. I have some questions for. Jane started to talk while she left her van, only then noticing the hospital garments that the two were still wearing. Oh my god, did you escape the hospital? Her observation, which was pretty much correct, nevertheless presented an obstacle from the retrieval of Mjolnir, and Yamamoto was about to crush the woman on the ground when his line of sight was blocked by the back of Thor, whose first instinct was to answer general friendliness with overbearing joy. Mortal. We indeed escaped the restraints of that evil place. But how do you know of us? Are you perhaps here to offer transportation to Mjolnir? It is my understanding that it is too far for my mortal form to reach on its own." Jane's expression became pained as she heard the madman talk, only to snap into focus with her previous night's discoveries. The anomaly that had let her take a picture of stars that were not the ones that she should have witnessed, along with the human shapes on the images, her theory of a wormhole. "We'd better get you off the street." Yamamoto was a very patient man, and once he understood that the woman speaking the local tongue meant to help, he had acquiesced to her request of joining her. It wasn't like such a woman could present a threat. And beyond that, the words of Wak were thundering in his ears once more, "You just didn't want to depend on a human." The general commander was many things, prideful among them, but a fool he was not. And more than anything, this Hinigami was one that learned from his mistakes, both in swordsmanship and in life. Once already he had refused out of pride resources that could have meant a massive boon later on. This woman wasn't promising to give him back his arm, but his last defeat at the hands of the ancient enemy left him reeling. He had been aware that he refused the help of those that didn't belong to the corps he had founded, it would have denied the importance of the corps in the first place. But now there was no strata to protect, no army to shape through example, no politics with the Central 46 to balance. After a short trip in the van, Yamamoto and Thor were led into a building, and then in a back room where many instruments beeped and whirred. Yamamoto was given strange garments that he nevertheless wore, turning from a murderous hobo into a respectable cripple. A couple of safety boots of his measure hid his feet, the edge of the black tracksuit trousers he was given was tucked into them, while a white shirt was stretched on his torso. Thor, now shirtless and wearing jeans, was still looking around for a t-shirt. Jane and Darcy, standing in the lab, couldn't help but notice the duo's forms. Darcy eyed the powerful builds, rippling biceps for Thor and a constellation of steely, scarred skin on the older man. "You know, for a crazy homeless guy, he's pretty cut." Darcy spoke while blatantly ogling Thor, only to add in a whisper, "And Methuselah looks like he could punch his way through a mountain range. Seriously, where the heck do they come from?" Jane turned away with heat rising to her cheeks, while Thor finally managed to take hold of a t-shirt. The ditzy in turn kept talking, this time directly engaging Thor. "Hey, sorry I tased you." The blonde warrior blinked in confusion, frowning thoughtfully. "You have a mighty weapon, mortal, take care to use it wisely." The flabbergasted woman made to answer, only to be interrupted when the elderly man barked something to Thor. "Was that Japanese?" "They can understand me because I still talk the Allspeak." The blonde explained, "You hear me in your native tongue." Jane had just returned to the room, dragging a very contrary Selvig behind her, only to stop at the explanation Thor gave, her eyes shining with unasked questions. Just as she was about to get started on her intensive questioning, the blonde warrior's stomach rumbled like thunder, and it was quickly decided to have a late lunch. It wasn't like Jane couldn't see the usefulness of keeping her science experiment happy while she grilled them. The small cafe had a very basic kitchen, so while the menu was rather simplistic, the food was genuine, cheap, and came in reasonable quantities. Yamamoto wasn't a very imposing man, but between the rippling muscles clearly visible under his white shirt, his missing arm, and stern expression, he wasn't approachable. And that was without considering the fact that he spoke only Japanese. And that Thor could understand him perfectly, which was still mind-blogging for the mortals that were sharing the meal with. With his eyes closed, Yamamoto distractedly perceived the inane chatter and meaningless people roaming in the small establishment. "Thank you for bringing us here." Thor loudly talked to Jane, who seemed a bit flustered by the distracted and apparently unknowing way in which the blonde answered to her questions without explaining anything. "You're welcome," she replied while pulling out a photo of the Bivarist. "Now tell me, what were you doing in that?" Thor studied the frame grabs with interest, only to turn dismissively back to his full plate. "What does anyone do in the Bivarist?" Everyone stared at him, while Selvig seemed to recognize the word. Jane opened immediately her notebook, quickly writing the word down. That seemed to attract the attention of the blonde warrior, who hunched over, still munching, eyeing the notations and drawings within the book, curious. The Bivarist. Selvig repeated skeptically, his eyes briefly glancing at the one-armed man sitting at the table, who had still to touch his food. Once Jane became uncomfortable with Thor standing so close to her, looking over her notations, she quickly closed the book. What exactly is the Bivarist? The span of attention of Thor was unfortunately short, and so he returned to his quickly emptying plate of steak and eggs. You could start by telling us exactly what happened to you last night. Jane spoke, or explaining with how you got inside that cloud. And how you could eat an entire box of Pop-Tarts and still be this hungry. Darcy butted in, earning herself a withering look. Thor remained unbothered and downed a cup of coffee. This drink. I like it. Yeah, it's great, isn't it? Darcy eagerly engaged the blonde hunk. Isabella makes the best coffee in town. As an answer, Thor raised his empty mug with a quick motion, with the intention of throwing it at the ground, only to freeze mid-movement, his eyes darting at the old man seated next to him, whose gray eyes were open by a fraction. He didn't have to speak, he didn't even make a sound, he simply turned his bald and scarred head around, making a show of observing the other humans at the diner. Thor mimicked his action, only then noticing that there was no sign whatsoever of broken mugs on the floor. The God of Thunder, apparently chastised, slowly brought the empty mug back on the cluttered table. How do you ask for another? Darcy took over, showing the blonde the ropes of being a civilized human being, while both Jane and Selvig's attention was turned to the elder man that had still to speak a single word since his question back at the lab. And who are you? Jane, once more walking all over her survival instinct, asked the scarred man, who proceeded to turn his head slightly towards Thor, who quickly enough picked up the need to answer. Yamamoto Shigekuni, the banished Asgarian, spoke. He's the one that rescued me from my constraints, and a powerful warrior. It's. Jane and Selvig exchanged a worried glance. It's a pleasure. You missed all the excitement out at the crater. A random man sitting at the bar spoke then, earning himself Jane's attention. What crater? The woman behind the bar asked. The man seemed to be enjoying his minute of glory. They're saying some kind of satellite crashed in the desert. We're having a good time with it till the feds showed up, chased us out. They said it was radioactive. And I had my hands all over it. Fucking feds. Another man replied from the bar, earning himself a raised mug, as if in a mock toast. Well, you're probably sterile now. Ah ha ha. Fuck off, Pete. The first guy replied, but he laughed along. Whenever they want something, they say it's radioactive to have us Hones flock go away. What did the satellite look like? I don't know anything about satellites, the first man replied. It looked more like a hammer than anything else. But it was heavy. Real heavy. Nobody could lift it. That got Thor's attention, who turned his eyes questioningly at Yamamoto, who simply nodded. Where was this? Thor asked as he rose from his seat, his patience finally growing too thin to hold him back. About 12 miles east of here. With that information, the God of Thunder grinned, his spirits soaring, and he quickly strode out of the diner, shortly followed by Yamamoto. Once Jane, Darcy, and Selvig caught up to the unlikely duo after having paid their tab, the scientist ran in front of the blonde man, stopping him from walking further. Where are you going? 12 miles east of here. He sidestepped Jane and resumed to stride determinedly down the street. Why? To get what belongs to me. On foot? And Mr. Yamamoto should walk 12 miles in the open desert? Are you insane? It would kill any sane man, never mind an elder. Besides, since when you own a satellite? Her comment about Yamamoto stole a peal of laughter from the banished Asgardian, who nevertheless kept walking. It's not what they say it is. And I'm looking for a mean of transportation. Whatever it is, the government seems to think it's theirs. You intend to just walk in there and take it? The scientist was stumped when the blonde simply nodded, his strides never slowing even as he left behind Selvig and Darcy. Yamamoto quiet on his left. If you take me there now, I'll tell you everything you wish to know. Everything? All the answers you seek and more will be yours, once I reclaim Mjolnir. Thor stared heavily into the eyes of Jane, stopping for the first time since they left the diner. She bit her lip, frowning in thought. Let me get the van. She ran towards the vehicle. "You could have probably just carried me there, couldn't you?" Thor asked Yamamoto while he looked at the retreating form of Jane, still trying to understand the reasons behind the God of Death's choice of not simply dropping the Asgardian where he needed to be. "If you can't reclaim your own weapon, how can you be worthy of wielding it?" the old man stonily asked. "You must overcome the challenge yourself, foolish whelp, not have me hand you success." Thor grimaced at the words he received. For an instant, he felt like he was being scolded again by Odin. That's it, please comment for a part 2.